Alex Hutchinson, welcome to the Victor Degree Podcast.
Thanks a lot for having me, Nick. I appreciate it.
So, Alex, if I am a viewer who maybe just clicked on this video because of the expertly crafted title, or perhaps the thumbnail caught their attention, or perhaps they were sent this podcast through Spotify or Apple Podcasts, maybe as a referral from a friend, why would I want to stick around and listen to what you have to say on the topic of endurance and athletic performance?
First, I'll just say it's all about the thumbnails. I just had a meeting with some editors from a magazine I write for, and we're talking about how to optimize thumbnails, because for like Google Discover, it's absolutely crucial that you can convey everything in the thumbnail. To answer your actual question, look, I'm a former scientist and a former endurance runner, and I've spent about the last 15 years digging into the science of endurance performance. So I describe myself as basically an endurance science journalist, and there are not a lot of endurance science journalists out there. So I think I have a lot of insight and experience into what it takes to be not just a top endurance athlete, but to think about endurance in your own life and how to optimize it. So hopefully that's something that will interest whoever clicked on the thumbnail.
Before we get into the topics of endurance, I have to ask, as a Canadian who hails from the Great North, Tim Hortons, perfectly rated, overrated, or underrated?
Oh, that is a controversial question. It's overrated here, but I think it deserves to be overrated in the sense that Canada doesn't have a lot of its own cultural institutions that are distinct from anywhere else. So I'm all about something that we Canadians can think about as our place, even if we get Timbits as a special treat quite a bit. Timbits are the little donut holes for those who don't know. And to my surprise, I'm actually getting kind of tired of them, and we've got a bunch of subpar ones lately. But it's still like on a long road trip, Tim Hortons is where we'll go for a treat. And not to go too far off topic, they just introduced pizzas, and they make the pizzas right in front of you. And Tim Hortons is a donut shop named after a hockey player, a Toronto Maple Leafs player from the 70s. But they make the pizza right in front of you. It cooks in like a minute and a half. It's actually pretty good. It may well be gone by the time this podcast even hits the airwaves, because these things often don't last very long. But Tim Hortons Pizza, that's my plug for it. If you're in Canada, give it a shot.
Interesting. Again, not to stray away too off topic, but yeah, it's always interesting with business. It's like, do you just do the thing that's been working forever and focus on that, or do you try and dabble in these other maybe side projects and side quests? So interesting. Tim Hortons and pizza. I never would have put those two together. Have you tried the pizza? Is that actually good?
I've had it twice because I had a bunch of, my daughters had a soccer tournament, so we were on the road a bunch, and I just needed something other than like a chicken Caesar wrap or whatever every place sells now. It was quite good. And McDonald's pizza, it was introduced in Canada back like 30 years ago, and it was also okay, but it didn't last long because, like you said, you kind of have to be careful about brand confusion, and I think Tim Hortons may be making a bit of a mistake with the pizza, which is why I say if you have a chance, get it before it disappears, because I don't think it'll be a long success.
I might have to make a trip up to Vancouver just for that. I will say some of my fondest memories from Vancouver, whenever I go to visit my cousins, is Tim Hortons on a rainy day. There are a few things in life that beat a warm coffee from Tim Hortons when it's raining outside. Those classic Canadian or Vancouver winters. Tim
Hortons in Toronto or Vancouver is one thing. I've done quite a bit of like wilderness travel in Canada, going up to, and so you're leaving from a small town in like northern Ontario or whatever. All of those places have a Tim Hortons, and it's always packed. It's packed. It's Tim Hortons is one thing in Toronto, but it's a real part of Canadian life across the country.
Yeah, I promise we'll get into endurance, but I have to ask, since you've done so many, you just mentioned wilderness journeys and travels, Banff National Park. I have yet to go, but I've heard amazing things. Do you recommend?
I do. I went with my family 2 years ago now, I think it is, 2 summers ago, and I've been half a dozen times. It's beautiful. I will say Banff is beautiful. North of Banff is Jasper, which has unfortunately been rocked by fires this this summer, but it's also beautiful. North of Jasper is another big park that's as big as Banff and Jasper, but it's totally unserviced. It has no like rangers. It has no trails. It's called Wilmore Wilderness Park. Same scenery, totally beautiful. Longer drive to get there. Nobody's there. I did a 10-day trip there at one point where we only saw people once. So Banff is beautiful, but it is packed in the summer unless you get well off the trails. So I definitely, I love it, but I also say if you have the time and the means to get a little farther off, it's even more beautiful when you're not elbow to elbow with other tourists.
Yeah, might have to grab an itinerary from you after this podcast, because
absolutely
exploring the Canadian wilderness, the little exploring that I've done in Vancouver has, opened my eyes to the beauty of Canadian wilderness. It's different than I'd say what you might experience in America, in some of the parks that we have down here. So that's definitely on my bucket list. All right, Alex, enough Canadian talk, because I'm sure people listening to this podcast want to know about endurance.
Apologies, everyone. Yeah, sorry, you got me started and I couldn't stop.
Yeah, we might have to do a separate podcast just on Canadian topics. So before we get into endurance and some of the takeaways from your book, overarching, what is endurance?
The definition I sort of used in my book is the struggle to continue against a mounting desire to stop. Sometimes people think of endurance as like a specific thing in a specific task, like it's how fast can you run a mile or what is your VO2 max. And those are facets of endurance, but I think it's a much broader topic, one that applies to mental tasks, cognitive tasks, to career related tasks, to athletic tasks. It's fundamentally, it's something that lasts over a period of time and that gets hard, and you don't want to keep doing it. And if it's easy, if it's like you don't need endurance to just keep lying on the couch watching TV because maybe you don't want to stop, but you need endurance to whenever you're having to overcome your natural inclination to stop or slow down or change, that requires endurance.
And so when I think about anything worth achieving in life, if it whether it's business, career, maybe your personal athletic goals, all of those things come with a moment or a collection of moments that are difficult. So as an example, I'll use swimming. I love to swim. Currently training to do a 1 mile open ocean swim, which might not sound like a lot for a lot of people, but trust me, through
that's a long way.
Yeah, through my training, I've come to realize that it's a far distance when it comes to swimming. But even during training, there's multiple moments where I'm ready to kick off the wall, and I say to myself, why not just stop here? Let's take 10-second rest. Maybe we can reassess where we're at after that rest, and then just maybe keep going after that. But yeah, it's like that little inner voice in my head that keeps telling me, just stop, just don't keep, don't go any farther. So I guess a little bit of insight as to what that inner voice actually is, and then why people should care about improving their endurance.
Yeah, these are not easy questions, I will say. Like the why is like, look, I'm a runner. I run like 6 days a week and have been for my whole life. I ask the why question every morning, right? Like why am I doing this again? And it's, articulating the answer is really hard. And, there's the famous quote, George Mallory, who died on Mount Everest before his last expedition in the 1920s. The New York Times asked him, why do you want to climb Mount Everest? And his answer was, because it's there, which is one of the, on the one hand, it's one of the sort of stupidest quotes ever. It doesn't tell you anything. But on the other hand, it articulates what a lot of us struggle with, which is like putting into words why we would want to do this. So I guess what I would argue is that the fact that it's hard is it's a truth that we have to accept, that it's hard to push beyond these limits, and these limits are the feeling that you don't want to do it. First, that's a normal feeling, and it makes sense. We've evolved to not waste energy, and so we have this powerful kind of homeostatic system that is like, if you're spending energy, we're going to make it hard so that you don't spend energy for nothing. You have to overcome that to make sure that you don't just waste your energy. So why would we want to do that? Why don't we just listen to our the voice or the urge that tells us to chill out and stop pushing? From a physical perspective, like you're not going to be healthy if you never move, right? Like you could stay on the sofa the rest of your life. That's not cool. But I think at a much deeper level, the conclusion that I've come to over the years is that the fact that it's hard is actually a feature, not a bug. That it's by overcoming challenges that we find actually meaning in life. The thing that a thing becomes worthwhile because it was hard. And even a very nice thing, if it's given to us with no effort, we don't appreciate it in the same way. We don't get the same feeling from it. And not to ramble on this too long, but there's a psychologist named Michael Inslick who's done a lot of work on something called the effort paradox, which is our assumption is that if something is hard, we value it less. So we would pay, this is like classical economic theory, Adam Smith. If something requires a lot of toil and trouble, we'll pay less for it. But in fact, in a lot of cases, it's the opposite. There's something called the IKEA effect, which researchers have shown. If you take, like, you have to put the coffee table together, what a pain in the neck, right? Like the stupid screws, and it's complicated. But once people do that, once they put together an IKEA piece of furniture, if you were to offer them the identical piece of furniture pre-assembled, they would actually value that pre-assembled piece of furniture less than the one they put together. They feel some sense of accomplishment from having overcome something, from having put effort in, and they value it more highly. And I think that's a sort of metaphor for pushing off that wall and deciding to keep doing your swim workout. You get to the end of the day, or you get to the end of the workout, and you feel like you've accomplished something, and you feel a sense of meaning. I'll cut it off there, but there's evidence to support. Like, I'm not just shooting my mouth off here. People study this, like, ask people to assess how much meaning they get, and doing hard things is a way of getting meaning in life.
Two points to that. It's interesting because as I think back to my own life, I think back to one of the more meaningful moments in my life up to this point, and it was receiving my undergraduate degree. And in the moment, I couldn't exactly pinpoint why it was so meaningful. I knew it was, it was almost this, a diploma is a signal of success, that you've accomplished something, but I still couldn't exactly pinpoint why it meant so much to me. And recently I've started to think back as I've talked to people like yourself and athletes and others, and they always say how anything that they've achieved that was meaningful came with great difficulty, something that you just alluded to. And so I thought back to my own experience, and I thought back to, the sleepless nights and all the nights, working on projects until 5 a.m. and all the difficulty I had to endure to get through that. And I think now I'm able to confidently say that is why that degree is so meaningful to me, because of how difficult it was in the moment. And then I heard this quote from Alex Hutchinson, who's this entrepreneur. I actually just said this quote in the last podcast that I did. So if people are listening back to back, they're going to hear this twice. But he talks about the hero's journey. And if you're creating a hero from scratch, what a terrible story it would be if the hero had no difficulty on their way to this, the summit or to success. And he said, look at your own life the same way, where if your own career and your own life is a hero's journey, how boring would it be if all you ever had, to do was easy, or if everything was given to you on a silver platter. And so he basically, illustrates that to say that people complain too much about difficulty, about challenging tasks, because it's required if you want to get to something that has meaning. So I ask you the question of why, because it's something that I've been thinking a lot about, and I think it's starting to clear up in my own head as to why I do certain things and why I even want to do this 1 mile open swim, because I think at the end of it I'll have this meaning attached to it that I can carry with me for the rest of my life.
I think that's right. And it's like, thinking about the undergrad degree. Obviously, there's a lot of important benefits that come with getting that degree, right? And so you might think, I value this degree because it's going to open doors for me and get my career started. But it's like if someone had offered, hey, Nick, I can provide you, I can just mail you the degree. You don't have to go to any of the classes. You don't have to do anything. I have a perfect replica. Don't worry. It's the perfect crime. Or it's not even a crime. We have permission. It's not a bad thing. I'm just going to give you the degree. You're not going to look back on receiving that degree with any meaning. It's not going to give you any satisfaction. Sure, it might open some doors for you, but it doesn't come with any meaning attached. So like you said, it's the the struggle isn't just like, oh, it takes struggle to get good things in life, but also the struggle itself is what makes them, makes us appreciate them, let's say.
Right. So Alex, I picked out a couple topics from the book that really stood out to me in certain particular moments. So I was hoping we could kind of go through these and discuss these. Obviously, if someone listening or watching has not read Endure, I actually have a copy of it right here because I was finishing it this morning. New York Times bestseller, recommended by Malcolm Gladwell, who many recognize. Just a fantastic book. I don't need to sell it any more than it's already been sold because it's a fantastic piece of work.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that.
But if you're interested in, if you're a fan of sports like I am or athletes, this book gives an excellent perspective on the question that I've been struggling with for a while too, is like what separates the great athletes from the rest of the pack. And having the Olympics this summer, we saw that separation through multiple events. So actually, before we even get into maybe some of the specifics of the book, let's tackle that question. When you look at some of the great athletes, what makes them as great as they are?
Again, $1 million question that scientists around the world are working on. So, look, let's start with some obvious things. There are some physical attributes that the greatest athletes have, some of which are born and some of which are made. So there's a cliche that if you want to win the Olympics, pick your parents well, and that's a true cliche, right? Like let's acknowledge that just as I can't work my way to being a 6'11" power forward. Either I'm 6'11" or I'm not. There are other traits that are harder to see, like how much oxygen your blood can carry to your muscles, that you have to be born with. So there's a price of entry, which is you have to have the tools, and no one can get that price of entry just by being born that way. There's also a ton of training that's required to cause your body to adapt in all the ways that are possible, whether that's by putting on muscle or building endurance, strengthening your heart. So there's a whole bunch of physical things. What's interesting to me is that if you were to take, let's say you go to the marathon start line and you say, okay, I want to predict who's going to win this race or what the order of finish is going to be. And so give me 2 hours in the lab with everyone who's going to run the marathon. I'm going to run every single test I can think of. I'm going to quantify every element of their physiology. And that's going to allow me to predict who's going to win the race. The bottom line is the predictions would be terrible. You would not get good predictions from that. Now, there are ways of predicting, for example, marathon times. You measure the VO2 Max, which is a measure of ability to deliver oxygen to the muscles. You measure running economy, which is kind of like the fuel economy of a car. How much energy do you take to cover a mile? You measure lactate threshold, which is kind of a measure of your ability to sustain, like how much of your maximum can you sustain for over a long period of time. And there's an equation you can plug this into. It'll give you a prediction of how fast each person will go. But the prediction is not very good when you get, like, if you compare me to an Olympic marathoner, the physiology has no problem saying that guy's going to win, that guy's not going to win. But if you compare a bunch of people on the start line, all Olympic athletes who've passed the basic tests of do they have the physiology no longer predicts who's going to win. So there's something else that's very hard to quantify that's going to determine who's and not that the gold medalist might not have some physiological edge over the 12th place finisher, but by and large you're not going to get reliable predictions. So there's and I take that to mean, first of all, that we still have lots to learn about physiology, but also that the brain plays a role, that there's something to do. There's beyond physiology, some people are better at getting everything out of themselves, getting the most out of themselves, rising to the occasion. So there's a psychological element that differentiates the champions from the 4th place and the 7th place and the 11th place people.
So let's talk about that, the role of the brain in endurance and athletic performance. And I specifically want to discuss a term that you brought up in your book, which is this idea of a central governor. And it's funny because I first came across this term when I read David Goggins' book, Can't Hurt Me. And he doesn't use the term central governor. He doesn't use the central part, but he does say that there's a governor inside your brain that basically dictates how much pain you're willing to endure, how far you're willing to go. And so he calls it, I have the quote pulled up here, he calls it the 40% rule. So he says that we normally only give 40%. And if you want to unlock the remaining 60%, you need to learn how to control this governor that's dictating your moves. So a little bit on what this governor actually is. What is this idea of a central governor?
Yeah, I mean, and I'll say like 40%. Okay, that's just a number. Like that's right. Not a real number, but the idea is what's important. And the term central governor was coined in the late 90s by a guy named Tim Noakes, who's a South African scientist. The basic idea, and I should also, the other preface is lots of controversy, lots of debate, lots of academic discussion, trying to it's not easy to peer, it's easy to look inside the body and see how the heart's working. It's not easy to look inside the head and understand what the brain is doing. But the general idea is, if you didn't have this governor to hold you back when you're approaching your limits, you could just run yourself to death or push yourself to death or whatever. You really want to win the Olympics, you're just going to keep pushing, and then it's like all the oxygen's going to your muscles, none is going to your brains or your heart. Your heart's going to stop working, your brain's going to black out, you're going to die. And so just over the course of evolutionary time, and it's not just about the Olympics, it's like you are chasing an antelope across the savannah to hunting. If you can give everything you've got, you're going to chase that antelope until you keel over, and then you're 20 miles from your home in the middle of the hot sun and you've got no energy left and you're going to die, or a predator is going to come and get you. So it makes sense that we have this some sort of system that really puts the limits on us to try to make sure we have energy left for emergencies. And so one way to see this or to think about this is like go watch your local 5K, stand near the finish line, stand a half mile or a quarter mile from the finish line, and you'll see all these people straggling in, exhausted, like they've given everything they've got. They turn the corner and they see the finish line in the distance, and they're like, woohoo! And they're suddenly sprinting at top speed. And it's like, why did you save all that energy for the sprint? And to them, it's like, oh, I wasn't saving energy. I was really, really tired with half a mile to go. And then with a quarter of a mile to go, I realized I was almost done and I suddenly felt fine. And so you think, well, these guys are clowns. They just don't know how to run a 5K. So you say, okay, let's look at the data from world record holders. Look at the pacing patterns for 5K, for the mile, for 10K, for whatever. And you find this very pronounced U-shaped pacing pattern where people start out fast, settle into a sustained pace, and then even for the greatest runners in the world, on the greatest day of their lives, they get to the last lap and all of a sudden they can pick it up. And so the way Tim Noakes would interpret this is the central governor is kind of making sure that they don't run out of energy. And you don't necessarily know exactly how long you're going to have to keep going when you're in a race. You don't have an exact sense until you get to that last lap or you turn the corner and see the finish line. Then you're like, oh, I'm going to be able to stop soon. I don't need to be so conservative anymore. I can release the energy. And this is something that's not conscious. You're not deliberately holding back. And I can say this as a runner. I've tried many times to say, don't be cautious. Just like give it everything you've got. And still you get close to the finish line and you realize, oh, I did have more. And so that fundamentally is what we're talking about with the central governor, that there's more energy in the tank. And on some level below your consciousness, your brain is saving it as a let's say an emergency supply or to protect yourself. But it's a big margin of safety. So David Goggins says it's 60% is being held there. If you look at some of there's literature like looking at muscle activation when people are lifting maximally. Are they really lifting using 100% of their muscle fibers? It's not 40%. It's probably closer to 90% or a little above 90%. But there's still some extra there. So then when you see that it's your kid who's under the car, you can lift a little harder, try to get the wheels of the car off your kid or whatever. That's kind of gruesome to say, but you know what I mean? This idea of like being able to dig deeper when the stakes are highest.
And throughout the book, you present it, the way that I interpreted the book and how it was written is that based off of research that there's basically two different schools of thought when it comes to endurance and athletic performance. And those two schools of thought differ in how they classify the mind and the body. And so perhaps there's a school of thought, which, you mentioned Tim Noakes, he was a big proponent of your mind really dictates your limits. And then there is perhaps a second school of thought that says, well, your body, your muscles, right, what's happening inside really dictates, sends signals up to your brain, which then tell you, hey, this is our current state. This is where we're at. So just general thoughts on that. And how would is it right to say that those are the two schools of thought?
So here's how I would divide it. There's two big camps. One is that it's all about the body. And if we understood enough about physiology, it's like your limits in a race or while lifting something are dictated by, what's your core temperature? Have you overheated, or what are your muscle fibers doing? Are you recruiting 100% of your muscle fibers, or, but it's like a car. I don't ask, or what are the fundamental limits of my car? Well, if I get on a straight flat piece of road and I put the gas pedal all the way down, that's as fast as the car can go. And it will keep going until it runs out of gas, or until the radiator boils over, or whatever the case may be. And there's no well, did the car try hard enough, or did the car pace itself well? No, it's like on a straight flat track, you just put the pedal down and that's it. And the body's the same. You can run as fast as your legs will carry you for as long as you have enough fuel and as long as you don't overheat. And so Tim Noakes' big contribution was to say, that's not, cars have a driver that make a decision. Like if you go too fast in a car, you're going to be burning fuel more quickly. Maybe if it's a long race, you want to drive at a slower pace so that you won't have to refuel as often. There's all these decisions that get made both consciously and unconsciously. And so the first school of thought is this: it's just the body. You're just like a car or whatever. It's like a machine. The second school of thought is no. It's crucially depends on the decisions and the regulatory control of the brain. Within that school of thought, there's then multiple streams that trying to answer the question of, okay, well, how does this kind of governor type thing work? What's happening? And so Tim Noakes and his initial research was suggesting, well, there's your brain just shuts off the nervous signals to your muscles when it detects danger or something. I think there's a sort of rival view, which I think is now probably more widely accepted, which is that actually it's not this sort of hidden unconscious circuit breaker that flips or whatever. That actually it all comes down to your sense of effort. That you consciously perceive how hard something is. So we talked about this earlier. That endurance is struggling to continue against a mounting desire to stop. And how do we sort of monitor that level of effort that we're putting in? Well, we have if I ask you, if you're in the middle of swimming, if I stop you halfway through one of your workouts and say, how hard are you working? A scale of 1 to 10. How hard is it to continue doing this? You can give me an answer. It's 6 out of 10. It's 8 out of 10. It's 3 out of 10, depending on how you're feeling that day. And that answer, what does that answer represent? It represents everything. It represents how hot you are. It represents how well you slept last night. It represents how fatigued your muscles are. It represents how motivated you are. So all these things are kind of integrated in one center in the brain, and your limits are when your effort maxes out. And so that incorporates that you're willing to try harder in the Olympics than you are, in a solo workout at the local pool. So I think, to me, that's the most compelling picture. And so it's not that it's all in your head. I think this is a really important point to make when I sort of talk about these two camps, the brain and the body. To say that effort is what matters is not that it's just like all you have to do is try and you can do anything. And if you want it hard enough, you can win the Olympics. Because your effort is dictated by what's happening in your body. And the fitter you are, the less sort of distress signals your muscles are going to be sending to you, the cooler you'll stay, the easier your body's working. So that all factors into how hard it feels, which in turn dictates whether you can push harder or whether you need to stop.
You mentioned, how, your body's internal temperature, and my mind immediately jumped to hydration. And you talk at great lengths in the book about the topic of hydration and some of the controversies of hydration that have come up in the past. And you even mentioned Gatorade, kind of the beginning story of Gatorade and how that came about, and its role in endurance. And then you also bring up an example of a high school football player, Max Gilpin, who basically died of, passed away of a heat stroke they were doing, as they normally do, high school football drills, I think in the summer months, July or August. And he pushed himself a little too hard and ended up passing away a couple of days later in a hospital. So what can we conclude from the example of Max? And then maybe we'll move on to this broader topic of hydration.
Yeah, so hydration, I guess I'll start by saying hydration is complicated. I think it's a really good illustration of the way mind and body interact, because there's dehydration in the sense of how much fluid is in your body, and then there's thirst in the sense of how thirsty you are. And those are not the same things. You can be, you can be thirsty. They move in different ways. So the thirst is kind of a warning that you're getting dehydrated. So, but I would, and you mentioned Gatorade, and there's kind of one school of thought is dehydration is like the great evil in society, and that, if we could get everyone drinking more water, all our problems would go away. And then there's a counter narrative, which actually Tim Noakes was associated with, which is that it's all a great conspiracy. This is all, Gatorade has funded a bunch of bogus research to make us think that dehydration is a problem. And actually, we don't have to worry about hydration at all. And it's, as long as you drink when you're thirsty, your body can take care of itself. It can avoid serious dehydration as long as you just drink when you drink. You don't need to worry about planning ahead or worrying about any of that stuff. I would take a middle path between those two extremes. I would say, we worry too much about dehydration. We were a little over obsessed with it, and that's fueled in part by advertising, not just by Gatorade, but by like bottled water companies. They fund a lot of research trying to suggest that it's like, oh, before you don't even know you're dehydrated, but it's secretly making you dumber, and those sorts of things. But dehydration can still be serious. And so one of the facets of this debate on dehydration is drinking what protects you from things like heat stroke. So Max Gilpin is not an isolated case. Football players and other athletes, it happens with very sad regularity that someone will get heat stroke after a really hard workout, particularly if you're a big guy wearing football pads, you haven't worked out, you're coming back for your first workouts in August, you're doing wind sprints with pads on and stuff. People get heat stroke sometimes. And so the assumption is you didn't drink enough if you got heat stroke. And in fact, what made the Max Gilpin case interesting is that his coach got charged with, I can't remember if the charge was murder or negligence or whatever, for not letting him drink enough, and that he would have been saved if he'd drunk more. And to cut to the chase, that what the court ended up concluding, and I think correctly on the basis of the scientific evidence, was that actually hydration had nothing to do with it. First of all, the players in the practice were allowed to drink frequently. So Max Gilpin had been drinking plenty. There was no evidence that he was dehydrated when he got heat stroke. He wasn't short on water. He was hot because it was hot and he was working hard. And your body's like an engine. If you're sprinting, you're generating heat. And so heat stroke and dehydration are two different things. They're not completely disconnected. It is, if you get too dehydrated, that will interfere with your ability to, you won't have enough blood circulating. And so it'll interfere with your, which is one way that we dissipate heat, by taking hot blood to the surface. And if you get really dehydrated, you won't be able to sweat effectively to keep cooling yourself. So it's not that they're completely disconnected, but drinking is not enough to protect you from dehydration, or from heat stroke rather. Heat stroke is about heat, and scientists aren't entirely sure what causes, like you do a practice with 40 football players and one of them gets heat stroke. They all did the same practice. Why did one person get heat stroke and the other didn't? Like, what is the difference? It's not clear. Sometimes it has to do with someone may have been sick recently. Sometimes it has to. There are some medications that are thought to change your sensitivity to heat. Some of the ADHD medications, and there are a few other factors. And so Max Gilpin, he was on ADHD medication. He had been sick before the practice. Nobody knows what the specific mix of fat and your gut function may, like if you have a leaky gut, then toxins can get into your bloodstream that predispose you to overheat. So it's a complicated topic, but it's not, despite this court case, it's not a question of like, oh, you got heat stroke if only you had drunk a little more water. And so, which is not to say that you shouldn't drink water when it's hot. It's just that it's not a magic cure-all. And it's not like you need to, I'm a little skeptical of the idea, the sort of, drink 82 gallons of water a day and, it's going to magically make you super healthy. I think it's a little overhyped. I generally try and drink when I'm thirsty.
One of the more fascinating parts of your book was you had a sentence in there, maybe it was a couple sentences, that basically said that the fastest finishers at marathons or long endurance events were the ones that were the most dehydrated.
Yeah, so this is interesting. Like, because the conventional wisdom in the 90s when I was, starting out as an athlete is that if you get 2% dehydrated, all bets are off. That's when the trouble is really serious. So that you take your starting weight. If you lose, so if you're 150 pounds, if you lose 3% of that, that's 3 pounds of fluid, then your performance is seriously compromised. So the drinking guidelines, hydration guidelines from the American College of Sports Medicine would say you need to drink enough to make sure you do not get more than 2% dehydrated. And this was just sort of accepted. Now, the reality is if you do a marathon on a warm spring day, most people will be sweating so much if they're pushing hard that it is impossible to drink enough to only get dehydrated by that much, because your stomach can't. There's a limit to how much water your stomach can get through your stomach, and so it is inevitable that you will get more dehydrated than that. And so if they started to do studies on, for instance, world record holders. They did before and after weighing of elite runners, including like when they were like a guy named Haile Gebrselassie when he set the world record, he had lost 10% of his body weight. So there's two possibilities there. One is that the 2% rule is wrong because the world record holder is losing 10%. The other is that, if only he had drunk more water, he would have run even like 10 minutes faster. And it's like, that doesn't seem plausible that the people who, and then like, as you mentioned, you can do studies of the more broader population. You take 500 people in a marathon, you weigh them before and after their races, and you look at their times and you plot it, and you see this relationship where the people who are running slower than 4 hours, they tend to be losing, 2.5% of their body weight. People who are running sub 3 hours, they're losing like 4 or 5% of their body weight. And there's a nice linear relationship. The faster people run, the more of their body weight they lost. And there could be two reasons there. One is that the faster people are pushing harder, they're generating more heat, so they're sweating more. It could also be that they're spending less time worrying about drinking at every aid station, and whereas the people who are going slower, maybe they're not breathing as heavily, they're able to drink more. But it doesn't even matter what the rule is. The bottom line is that these kinds of pieces of evidence, to me, push back at these sort of simple rules like the 2% rule, like always make sure you're not going to get more than 2% dehydrated. You don't want to stay 2% dehydrated, but you can handle 4% dehydration for a little while, and then when the marathon ends or whatever, you drink enough to get back to your baseline.
So what's the conventional wisdom now for marathon runners when it comes to water consumption or Gatorade consumption during a race?
Yeah, so once again, not a simple question, because marathon runners when they're drinking at aid stations, they're not just trying to stay hydrated, they're also trying to take in sugar. And fundamentally Gatorade, what does Gatorade give you, or any other sports drink? It's water and sugar. Those are the active ingredients. Forget all the other stuff that's on the ingredients list. That's just salesmanship. So for marathoners, the real limiting factor is how much sugar they can digest. And so and to digest the sugar, you have to have an appropriate amount of fluids in there too. You can't just sort of down sugar packets. And so their fluid consumption is actually mostly dictated by the attempts to get in 60 to 90 grams of carbohydrate per hour. In terms of staying hydrated, and it's mostly dictated by what they can handle. So an experienced marathoner will try in training runs and see how much sports drink and water they can handle without getting stomach upset. And that will, because the bottom line, look, if you could magically stay hydrated for the whole marathon, that's great. But the real world practical situation is to take that time to drink. It's hard. You have to slow down. You're not breathing right, and then you're risking stomach upset. And it's a relatively common thing that people are like, I have this plan. I'm going to drink, every 5K, I'm going to drink this much. And by the time they get to the half marathon, they're off in the porta potty losing 5 minutes because they have an upset stomach, or they run the whole thing feeling like they're just like this. They have this barrel of water sloshing around in their stomach that's not emptying. So I would say the rule, what the advice I would give to someone who's about to run a marathon, and I think it's consistent with what most scientists would say, is drink when you're thirsty, and try and match everyone has a different sweat rate too. That's the other thing. So some people, if I were to give an amount that people should drink, for some people that would be actually more than it would be way too much, and for some people it would be not enough because they're sweating like 3 times the rate. But if you can try and keep your sweat losses close towards 2 to 3%, that's great, but it should not be at the expense of drinking to the point of discomfort. It should be, and really what you have to avoid, like people die from hyponatremia from drinking too much. This is what really caused things to turn around, is in the early 2000s. The advice was drink as much as you can tolerate to try and avoid dehydration. And so people would just drink at every water stop. And if you're actually gaining weight during a marathon, that's a bad sign. And you don't want to be doing that. You should not be drinking more than you're sweating out.
I keep saying one of the more fascinating parts of the book, but it's because there's so many fascinating parts to the book. I'm also starting to realize that I'm asking maybe the king of complicated questions here, but
those are the interesting ones, right? Like if they're
right.
Easy to answer, there's not much more to say.
Right, exactly. But there is a placebo effect that you mentioned with drinking water or any of these sports drinks, where, and I think you tried it out yourself, where you don't necessarily swallow the drink. You just kind of swash it around in your mouth and then spit it out. And there have been studies that have shown that actually increases performance. And I thought about I'll watch a soccer match, and now they have, if the heat index is above a certain level, they'll have like these in the first half, I think in the second half they'll have these periods of time where it's like, all right, let's take a 5-minute break for everyone to rehydrate. I think it kind of came in after COVID, but so they'll often show a lot of these soccer players, drinking water or whatever. And I noticed a lot of them were spitting out the water. And after reading your book, because at the time I thought maybe they're just, I don't know, bored, or maybe they think it's cool to spit out the water, or, whatever. But after reading this and some of the research that you've highlighted, I'm almost starting to think that maybe there is some actual scientific evidence behind just keeping the water in your mouth, spitting it out, and that ultimately helps you, versus, to your point, maybe taking in too much water, and that ultimately can, decrease your performance over the long run. So thoughts on that?
Yeah. I mean, I would be reasonably certain that the training staff on professional soccer teams are very familiar with this research and are giving that advice that, look, if you can drink, that's great. Drink what you can. And then if your stomach is feeling full or whatever, even there's also research, I don't think I mentioned in the book, but there's research even just like rinsing cool water in your mouth helps increase your perception of coolness. But if you have cool sports drink in your mouth, then it's actually pretty cool. It's clear that your brain can sense the presence of carbohydrates in your mouth, although no one has identified how it's sensing that, because it doesn't work with artificial sweetener. It only works with actual carbohydrate. It gets the message that fuel is coming. Then you spit out the sports drink, but your brain doesn't know that. And so it kind of dials down the central governor a little bit. It releases some of your reserves of energy without you having swallowed anything. You can't trick your brain forever, because it's also keeping track of how much energy you actually have. But so in the marathon world, or in the cycling world, this is something that people will use in the last portion of a race. So let's say you're running a marathon, you've been out there a couple hours already, you've drunk everything you can, you've taken all the gels you can, you're starting to feel pretty queasy, your stomach is maxed out. Last 15 minutes, last half an hour of the race, maybe you're going to try and choke down a little more, but also you're just going to rinse stuff in your mouth and spit it out. You're going to try and give yourself that boost that's going to last to the finish line without upsetting your stomach. So for soccer players, they're running at high intensity. It's not great to have, 3 pounds of fluids in their stomach. So maybe in a 5-minute break, they're going to try and take some sips of fluids. They're going to try and get some fuel in, and then they're also going to try and rinse and spit, and that'll maybe get them to halftime where they can refuel more fully.
I want to jump to the topic of oxygen, and this is going to sound like a really stupid question, but I promise there's a lot more to it than maybe meets the eye. The importance of oxygen and what your research has shown you in that realm.
Yeah, I mean, oxygen is pretty fundamental, and to me, there's like two angles to that. You can look at what happens if you get more oxygen and what happens if you get less oxygen. So there's a lot of really cool research at altitude on not just how we react in the short term, what it feels like to be at altitude if you're trying to climb Everest, but also how your body adapts over the long term to make do with less oxygen, so that then when you go back to sea level, you're performing better, and you can make better use of the oxygen. So altitude training has become it's long been a big thing in endurance sports like cycling and running, but now a lot of team sports are incorporating altitude into it. But more fundamentally, I think there's a lot of attention these days on this idea of VO2 max as the ultimate measure of kind of like fitness, aerobic fitness, and also as a really good predictor of longevity, of how are you doing? How are you going to be handling life when you're 80 or 85? Well, VO2, having a healthy VO2 max is really important. And what VO2 max is, it's simply a measure of how much oxygen you can take in and use and distribute to your muscles. So, you can breathe as heavily as you want, but that doesn't do anything unless while the oxygen is in your lungs, it's diffusing into your bloodstream, and then your heart is pumping it to your muscles, and then your muscles are taking it out of the bloodstream and using it to generate the most efficient source of energy for your muscles, through aerobic metabolism. So VO2 max is how much oxygen you can use, and that's really a fundamental thing to performance, but also increasingly people are understanding to long-term health.
What should here's another challenging question, the golden question. What should people do to increase their VO2 max?
Fundamentally, they should move. You can get as specific as you want with do interval workouts lasting between 2 and 5 minutes per bout, repeated multiple times, and that's probably the most effective VO2 max increasing workout. Or do short, high intensity interval training, 30 seconds as hard as you can with a repeated, 4 to 6 times. And that's a time efficient way of getting pretty good VO2 max results. But if there's one thing we can conclude from, decades of endurance sports research, it's that there's a lot of different ways of increasing VO2 max, and fundamentally do something that gets you out of breath, and do it regularly. So find something, rather than thinking about what's the most optimal way of increasing my VO2 max, the real advice is, what is the most enjoyable for me, practical, feasible, thing that's going to fit into my life so that I'm doing it not just for 4 weeks while I'm motivated, but I'm doing it for 4 years or for the rest of my life. Because there's a guy named Michael Joyner, who's a very prominent physiologist from Mayo Clinic, who is also a very entertaining speaker and really creative thinker. And I've seen him give talks a few times, and he loves to give an example from the 1964 Olympic 5,000 meter final. He basically puts up a slide showing the finish and saying, this is everything you need to know about exercise physiology. Because in the top 4 runners that day were 4 very famous runners who represent basically the 4 main schools of thought about endurance training. You know, one guy did nothing but interval training, like literally every day, twice a day, he would go to the track and do, 100 meters, take a jog, 100 meters, he would do 20 by 100 or 40 by 100, nothing but interval training. Another guy did nothing but long, slow distance. Everything was a jog. So he did huge amounts of running. None of it was fast, but he just accumulated volume. Another guy was basically from the University of Oregon, a forerunner of the kind of modern mixed training. It got called the hard easy school for a while, because you would do a hard interval day, then an easy jogging day, then a hard interval day, then an easy jogging day. Another guy did, a guy named Ron Clark from Australia, did nothing but middle intensity runs, what we would now call threshold runs or tempo runs or lactate runs, maybe even zone 2, zone 3 runs. Everything was like not a sprint, but not a jog. And the 4 of them, they all came, it was a sprint finish. So there were many different roads that led to Rome, and those Olympics were in fact in Rome. And so you can pick your road, and maybe that road is playing, pick up hockey a couple times a week and then getting out a few other times to do something else. Unless you're trying to win the Olympic marathon, it's more important to find something that will fit into your life than it is to worry about the marginal 5% that you might get from doing the perfect workout.
Have you seen the what is it called? The midwit meme on Twitter. It's this meme where essentially there's 2 people at either sides of a bell curve, and then there's one guy exactly in the middle, and the 2 opposite sides are supposed to represent, the 2 sides at the extreme are supposed to represent, like, simple life advice. So like if you're looking to lose weight, it could be, hey, eat nutrient dense foods and work out 3 times a week. That's the advice. And then the guy in the middle is like, you have to track your macros, you have to use, this level of, whatever. It's like all this complicated.
Yeah. And look, I write for mainstream magazines. I was a columnist for Runner's World for 5 years. And so I get it. Like you kind of, if the advice is too simple, it's like, well, it's, we're halfway through the year. We still have a bunch more magazines to fill, or like, now it's all websites. Like, what are we going to write tomorrow? Because it can't be the same as today. And, like people at Runner's World and elsewhere are smart, and they try to, I should say not they, but we in the sort of sports science media are doing our best not to over complexify things. But the fact is, the sort of incentive of the attention economy on places like Twitter, it's inescapable. You're always trying to think of something new or different, when in reality, the fundamentals of what you need to do are very simple and very unchanging. And so, yeah, you want to try and, for someone like me as a journalist, I try to remember that and resist the temptation, but it's hard. Like you're always looking for like, oh wait, this new workout, like, oh, you're going to lift the weight like this, and that's going to be what allows you to finally gain muscle. It's maybe not.
Yeah. Well, I think it's prominent in almost every field. I even take podcasting and, I guess to maybe, bridge the 2 fields. The basic advice in podcasting is like, become a better listener. Like that's, at the end of the day, like that's how you're going to make the most gains, is if you really try to listen to your guests and then ask questions based off that. And really everything flows out from that. If you do a great interview with one guest, guess what? Maybe that guest is more likely to refer you to other people, and that's how you build your network, etc. But then there's also the other side where it's like, well, you have to use AI and you have to add all these, really curated captions.
You have to write the right thumbnail.
Right.
Yeah. No, so we all fall prey to that. You're right.
Right. It's like you have to use this specific color if you're talking about this specific topic. And if you're, and it's like I sometimes lose my mind trying to keep track of all of it. And at the end of the day, I just come back to the basics, which is like, do your research, make sure you have good questions, listen to your guest, make sure it's a great interview that, both your guest and your audience are going to enjoy. And then I think everything else will kind of take care of itself. So it's funny how it's prominent in every field. Alex, I want to get back to kind of more of the mental side, and specifically when it comes to mental endurance. You talk about this thing called response inhibition. What does that mean?
So response inhibition is basically the ability to not do what your brain and your body are automatically wanting to. This is an idea that gets talked about in a lot of different ways. So, a number of years ago, there was Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, and he had this framework of System 1 and System 2, where there's two different kind of systems of thought, and System 1 is very fast and automatically. As soon as you touch the hot stove, you pull your hand off without even any thinking. And System 2 is the more thoughtful, it takes but slower system that takes cognitive effort to think, well, no, maybe I need to do this thing that I'm instinctively, you're going to overrule your instincts. And so response inhibition is basically how good at you are at overcoming the first thing that comes, your first instinct. And so in the context of endurance sports, that's like it's all response inhibition, because you're out there running a marathon. Every part of your mind and body is saying slow down, and so you're having to overrule this your automatic response. In the lab, they can test it with they flash up letters or colors or signs or shapes or whatever, and get it into a pattern so that your automatic instinct is to do one thing, but you have to notice and overrule that and catch yourself before you press the wrong button. You have to inhibit your automatic response. They do that. There's something called the Stroop task, for example, where it's like, I'm trying to remember, it can be set up in different ways, but it's like the word red colored green and the word green colored red, and so you're either told to press buttons based on the meaning of the word or the color of the word. And so you get trained to do one, and then you have to do the other, and you have to respond, inhibit what has become your automatic response. So, but all of this is connected to this task in endurance and in life of sometimes doing what's not the easiest or most automatic thing.
You bring up this contention in your book. Do great athletes, are they just gifted with a naturally high pain tolerance, or is that something that they're able to develop through years of training?
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of research on athletes and pain tolerance, and so one thing that's clear is that there's a big difference between athletes and non-athletes in pain tolerance, and it depends on the level of the athlete. The better athletes have greater pain tolerance. One of the studies I liked, it was on like ultra endurance runners, mountain runners. And they did like an ice, they call it a cold presser test in the lab. Basically, it's an ice challenge. You stick your hand in ice water, and how long can you leave it there? And in the control group, the normal population, it's like, there's a range, some of them make it to 30 seconds, some to a minute, some to a minute and a half. A couple of them made it all the way to 2 minutes when the safety protocol says you have to stop. The mountain runners, every single one of them made it to 2 minutes. No problem. They could have kept going for longer. They're just like, no, it's just pain. I'm used to ignoring pain. So it's definitely a thing. Now, is it born or made? It's probably a little mix of both, but it's for sure not just born. And so there was a classic study back in the early 80s with Scottish swimmers looking at like recreational, amateur and elite swimmers. And the more elite you were at the sport, the greater your pain tolerance was. And this was a pain tolerance with like actually a blood pressure cuff squeezing their arm. But what was interesting is that the pain tolerance of the elite swimmers varied depending on the time of year. So their pain tolerance was greatest at the time of their like championship swimming season. And then during their off season, it was lowest. So even these are athletes who've been training for years. So it's not like it's some trick they learned that once they learned it, it's there. It's that it's something they had to develop and maintain over time. And that they're doing that presumably by training in the swimming pool and practicing overcoming their response inhibition, or using their response inhibition and overcoming their, experiencing discomfort and learning how to handle it.
Based off of your research, then, is the way to train this response inhibition, is that just the result of doing more hard things and overcoming those hard things? Is there a method to it?
I think fundamentally it's what you said. It's put yourself in positions where you have to do it. Now, is there a benefit to doing it systematically? That's another thing. There's an area of research on like brain endurance training, which is deliberately incorporating mentally challenging tasks into your training. So, one way of doing this, I did a version where it's just like you sit in front of the computer screen and you do these computer tasks. But the more sort of modern version of it is let's say you're doing a workout in the weight room or something, and in the rest between sets, you're running over to an iPad and doing mentally challenging things in between the physically challenging things, or you're doing them both at the same time. There's some reasonable evidence that this approach does work to improve your mental endurance. Whether it's a practical use of your time, especially if you're not competing, at the Olympic level, I'm not convinced, because it takes a toll, right? Like I've tried these things out. It's like, it's tiring to do this stuff. And it's like, maybe I would rather be just out running more or resting for tomorrow's run so that I can do a harder workout tomorrow rather than tiring myself out sitting at the computer screen. So I think the bottom line, the way it happens naturally is you do hard things, and that trains you to do hard things in the same way that by getting out and fatiguing your body adapts and gets stronger. You fatigue your mind, it adapts and gets stronger. It's possible to specifically target the mental side, but I'm not sure it's kind of worth the price.
Yeah, and I've noticed it through my own training, the effect of mental fatigue. And I think you brought it up in your book, but I mean, for anyone listening, just try it out for yourself. Go for a workout after a long day of work, or maybe particularly hard work. Doesn't have to, not necessarily physical work, but it could be mentally draining work. And then go try to work out versus wake up first thing in the morning and go work out and compare the results. I would be inclined to say that you're probably going to get better results if you do it first thing in the morning when you're mentally fresh.
Yeah, so that's definitely my experience. Now, people have different circadian rhythm patterns. If you're like a night owl, then doing your workout at 7 o'clock, it may suck for a variety of reasons. But I've definitely noticed, like my work is mostly completely sedentary, but I sometimes meet people for workouts at like 5 o'clock. If I have had a deadline where I need to get an article submitted at like 4:30 and then I go out and try and do a workout, it's like I've just been rolled over by a bulldozer. Like, it's completely different. And it's not that my legs are tired. It's just that ability to keep pushing myself, to keep kind of holding my finger as close to the flame as possible. It's gone because I'm totally mentally fatigued. So I think it's definitely a real phenomenon. And so one of the researchers who does this, who has done research on brain endurance training, he said something that I thought was interesting. It was like, basically, for most people, yeah, going and sitting in front of a computer doing brain endurance training, maybe not all that useful. But you can be alert to the opportunities in life to practice this skill. And you can reframe some of your training. So he's like, maybe you were up last night with a sick child or something like that. You didn't get as much sleep as you wanted. You had a big workout scheduled in the morning. So you have two choices. You can say, this workout is not going to be good, so I'm going to delay the workout. I'm going to scrap the workout and I'm going to do it tomorrow or the next day because I didn't get a good night's sleep. Or you can say, I'm going to do the workout. It's not going to be as fast or as good as it would have been if I was fresh, but it's going to be an opportunity for me to get that feeling of pushing through when I'm not feeling good, which is what the second half of my marathon is going to feel like. So it's a form of brain endurance training where you're taking that natural opportunity, that natural stimulus of, I didn't get a good sleep, or I had a really hard day at work today, so I'm kind of sapped, and say, all right, this is now less of a physical workout and more of a mental workout.
Staying on the topic of, of your mentality and how that may affect performance, you talk about the role of self-talk, and it reminded me, so we had Dr. Jim Lair on the podcast a couple weeks ago. Jim is a world-renowned, I mean, most of his work centered around tennis. He's worked around, he's worked with some of the best tennis players in the world, the Jimmy Connors of the world, and multiple number ones. And I asked him, what do tennis players struggle with the most? Because as a tennis fan, I watch them on TV, and for the most part, they seem calm, they seem present in the moment. But I'm sure, on the inside, they're at war with their own mind. And he had said that they did this research where they essentially strapped a microphone to tennis players, maybe back in the 80s and 90s, and they would record them, during a practice session or during a match. And the request of the tennis players would be, hey, everything that you're thinking about, all that you're saying to yourself, just say it out loud so we can record you. And after the match, they would go and play the recording back to the players, and the players couldn't believe that it was them who was saying all these things, like, you suck, why'd you hit your backhand like that, that serve was terrible, that forehand was way off. And so obviously the research was to show the players how negative they are during the course of a match and how to flip that and become more positive. So I thought that was interesting. And it's so prevalent in so many aspects of our life, whether it be your career or your training. It's like how you talk to yourself. Jim brings up the example of, if you were to tell your friend the advice that you tell yourself, they would probably say you're a bad friend. Like, I don't want to be friends with you. This advice sucks. So all that to say, your kind of theory on the role of self-talk and how instrumental it is to success.
Yeah. And first of all, that this observation you made about how negative people's self-talk is, it's a widespread phenomenon. And there was another study actually that I wrote about recently comparing self-talk in marathon runners and badminton players. And there are differences because it's a skill sport versus endurance, but the overwhelming similarity is that the top kind of sentiment people are saying is, I can't do this. Why am I doing this? I'm not good. It's just super negative. That's how people think. Now, why does self-talk matter? It's you could say, I'm a big boy. I sticks and stones will break my bones, but names will never hurt me. So it's if I'm telling myself I'm not good, that doesn't matter. It doesn't mean I'm not trying. So to me, what kind of got my attention was fitting this self-talk idea into the idea I talked before about effort being the kind of master switch. Your subjective perception of effort is the master switch that determines whether you can keep going or whether you've reached your limits. So this sense of how hard you're pushing. And like we said, it's integrating all the signals from your body. It's integrating how hot you are and how tired your muscles are, and whether you slept well last night. It's also integrating, it's being framed by the self-talk in your head. So how do you interpret a given level of muscular fatigue and body temperature and lactate and things like that? Is this an 8 out of 10 effort or a 7.5 out of 10 effort? Well, if you're telling yourself, this is so hard, this is the hardest thing I've ever done, I have no idea why I signed up to do this, this is awful, then you're much more likely to conclude that, yeah, this is an 8 out of 10, maybe even a 9 out of 10 effort. I should probably slow down. This is so hard. Then if you're telling yourself, oh man, this is challenging, but this is what I signed up for. I'm ready for this. I know I've done the training. Then, so the idea is that effectively what your internal monologue will have an influence on your perception of effort, which will in turn dictate whether you're able to keep going. And there's, again, these are hard things to study because we can't put a microphone inside the brain of everybody. But there's some pretty suggestive evidence that suggests that this is exactly what happens. That if you train people to have more positive self-talk, that in fact the perception of effort for a given level of effort or for a given physiological stimulus, the perception of effort gets a little easier and they're able to push harder.
To tie into that a little bit too, there's a quote near the end of your book that really stuck with me. And, you compare how, I think at the Kentucky Derby, I think I haven't looked at the updated times, but basically for the past 50 years, horses have not gotten much faster. I think maybe the world record still stands. Whereas humans, when it comes to marathons and races, we seemingly consistently and continually seem to push the envelope and get faster every year. And it's this virtual competition that we create, within ourselves, or maybe it's human nature where, I think you mentioned if you see somebody with a time of an hour, 59 minutes and 3 seconds, you're going to think that maybe you can do it in an hour, 59 minutes and 2 seconds. What is that? What's that all about?
Yeah, I mean, so this is actually really interesting research that has looked at human records in a variety of disciplines compared to horse racing records and dog racing records. Because one of the ways people explain human progress, because every 4 years there's always a series of articles saying, is this the last Olympics where we'll see world records? Have we reached the limits of human performance? And then it's like a bunch of records get broken, and then the explanation is, well, the technology has changed. The running shoes are better, the swimming pools are faster, the swimsuits or whatever, the baseball bats are bigger, whatever the case may be. And there's truth to that, right? Like I always say, running shoes are better than they used to be, but it's not. And our knowledge of nutrition and our knowledge of the supplements or whatever. The thing is, there's a ton of money in horse racing and dog racing. Whatever physiology we know about training, we're using that for dogs and horses too. So if it's just technology, we should expect that dogs and horses will get faster. But what the results show is that you look back over a couple hundred years, there was progress in all three animals up until about the 1950s, and then the horse racing and dog racing records kind of level off, not just at the Kentucky Derby, but at big races around the world. And the Secretariat still holds the Kentucky Derby record from 1973, I think it is, or two, I can't remember. Whereas human records keep edging down. And so, as I said, my sense is like, if you're a horse racing today, you can't race against Secretariat. You don't know how fast Secretariat went. You're just a horse. You run as fast as you can on that day, and if you're better than everyone else, that's all you can ask for. A human is like, somebody ran a marathon in 2:01, so maybe I can run a marathon in 2 flat. And you can go beyond that. It's like, well, why are the Kenyans so good at marathons? Is it because they're born that way? Probably there's something there, but there's also the sense that if you train in a lot of the Kenyan runners come from one small region. And so if you grow up and like 3 of your cousins are professional runners and your uncle won the Olympics, and then you go and train with a big group, and in that group there's a bunch of people who are competing internationally and went to the Olympics, and you run with them every day, then pretty soon you're going to come away with the impression that they can do this, I can do this, I can run this fast. And so there's an incredible self-belief that is unavailable to horses. And if you're a marathoner, it's also kind of unavailable to, people living in Toronto or whatever, because you don't know anybody who has ever run a fast marathon. So it's a self-perpetuating cycle that creates the self-belief, which manifests in positive self-talk.
Yeah, Scott Galloway had this advice. Somebody asked him, what's your advice, to any 20-year-old who's just starting their career? And he compared it, he used a tennis metaphor, and he said, well, if I was starting out in tennis, my goal would be to get to Wimbledon and, play against, one of the greats, Nadal or whoever, or surround myself with greatness, because only then would I quickly understand that I'm either good enough to maybe compete at this level or I'm not. And so his advice was, if you're starting out in your career, go surround yourself with other people who maybe you want to be like one day, maybe whose career you'd like to emulate, and you'll quickly find out, am I made out for this, or should I go pursue something else? And it's interesting because it ties into a little bit of your example of, the Kenyan runners, where, I'm sure that little boy growing up, he's surrounded by all these amazing runners. He will quickly find out, obviously there's physiological differences between a young kid and, an adult, but he'll quickly find out, hey, I can do this or I can't do that. And I think just that feedback and how quick that feedback can be, I think ultimately helps a lot, because it helps steer the ship in a quicker way.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I will also add that little boy shouldn't like you said, there's differences, that shouldn't underestimate the extent even if the guy is 20 years old, he shouldn't underestimate the extent to which he can change. And so it's not just being surrounded by other runners who are good, it's knowing them well enough to understand 5 years ago this guy wasn't a world beater, but he trained his ass off for 5 years and now he is a world beater. So it's not just it's possible for humans, but it's possible to change. And again, there's difference, like we were saying earlier with basketball, you can't train to be 6'11", so there's some things you can change and some things you can't. But I think people often underestimate the progress they can make in a lot of fields.
There's more in there if you're willing to believe it. What does that quote mean to you?
It's the last line of the book. It's funny. What I meant when I wrote that was summing up what we're talking about, that to access your maximum potential, you have to have acquired the confidence that you're capable of doing that. That it's not just going to happen by going through the motions. You have to believe you're capable of achieving at a given level in order to. It's not that if you believe you can achieve, you can't just do anything just because you believe it. But if you don't believe it, you're not going to be able to get everything out of yourself. The funny part of that quote, if you believe, there's more in there if you can believe it, is I got called out on it at a book signing at one point by a woman who's like, "You got to the end of your book and it sounds like you didn't actually fully believe what you're saying about sports psychology." And I thought about it, and I had to admit, it's like, yeah, there's some truth there. That's not how I intended it, but there's some truth there that I come from like a hard science background. I studied physics in university. I'm a very empirical guy. Like, you want to make a claim if something improves my performance, show me the evidence. And so, and in my own athletic career, I was uninterested in sports psychology. I was only interested in, like, how do I improve my VO2 max? What's the optimal workout? In researching and writing this book over the years, I've come around to the idea that sports psychology is important, that things like self-talk matter, but it's still not a natural fit to me, right? Like, it's still, I'm still sort of naturally skeptical, looking for the evidence. And I think it's an evolving area, trying to figure out how we tap into the mental side of endurance. I'm now convinced that it's important, but yeah, there's more in there if you can believe it. It's like, it represents the fact that it is still kind of an uphill struggle for me to convince myself that, yeah, the soft side matters as much as the measure, the stopwatch.
Why do you think we have that tendency to underestimate the power of our thoughts? I asked the question not knowing myself what that answer is, because I've seen that struggle where I at one point thought, well, if I just train, to your point, if I just train hard enough, I'll get to this. But I never considered the power of my own beliefs. And then I had George Mumford on the podcast, who is well known in the field of mindfulness and has worked with, the Phil Jackson Bulls and the Lakers and Kobe and Shaq and all these amazing athletes, and has taught them the power of mindfulness. And I'll never forget, I asked him who his best students were, and he said, Kobe and MJ. And he said Michael Jordan's best ability, bar none. He actually asked Phil Jackson once, he said, what's Jordan's best ability? And for basketball fans, they might say, oh, it's his jump shot or his athleticism, and Phil Jackson said his ability to stay in the present moment and to just be aware of his surroundings and be aware of what's happening within his body. And he attributes a lot of that to George Mumford and the work that he did with him. Wow. And so I hear stories like that, and then I read your book, and I'm now listening to you, and yet I still have almost this tendency to underestimate the power of the mind. Why do you think that is?
I think there's a couple of things. I don't have the answer, but I'll share a couple of thoughts. One is just, look, it's easier to believe in things we can measure and see, right? So there are things that are very easy to test, very easy to check. We can demonstrate it. And so, I know that training works. I know that eating right, it makes a difference, because there's studies that can convince me. And the mind is a black box still, despite our best despite the best efforts of scientists. We barely understand how it works, let alone being able to show how it matters. So that's one thing. I think another factor is that there's so many, I'm trying to think how to phrase this. There's so many snake oil salesmen out there trying to peddle us crap that we build up a natural skepticism. So in the athletic space, and this includes some of the greatest athletes, they're not snake oil salesmen, but here's an example. There's a video I like of Shaquille O'Neal doing a testimonial for power balance bracelets or power balance bands. This is a piece of plastic that you put around your wrist, right? It's completely useless, but he was convinced that it made him a better basketball player. And so I think the way we all grew up in this environment where people are making these claims about what made them successful because they don't really know what made them successful. And so I think we end up being very skeptical of things that we can't prove. And so, I reinterpret that now. I say Shaquille O'Neal believed in power balance bracelets because it made him confident in himself, and it created that self-belief, and that's what the benefit was. But I think our instinct is to get to be more skeptical as a result.
Alex, as we wrap up this episode, there is a little tradition that we do here on the Victory Degree podcast. So every guest, I ask to leave a piece of life advice for the following guest, but the catch is that you do not know who the next guest is going to be. And so our last guest on the podcast was Brian Dickinson. Actually very fitting given the conversation that we've had here today. Brian summited Mount Everest, became snowblind at the summit, and then had to descend back down Mount Everest, essentially blind. If you're not familiar with Brian's story, I highly recommend, not just you, but anybody listening, go pick up a copy of the book, Blind Descent. It was a fantastic read, and Brian's journey is certainly incredible. And so Brian's advice for you, again, not knowing that you're coming on next, was train for all the things that are within your control, and then learn to respond well to everything that is outside of your control. Given what has happened with our technology here today, I feel like that is fitting advice, not only for yourself, but for me as well. So first of all, what does that advice mean to you? And what is the piece of advice you'd like to leave for our next guest?
Yeah, that's great advice. It's one of those pieces of advice that makes complete sense, but is difficult to put into practice sometimes, even though you know you should. So, but kudos to you for rolling with the punches, and hopefully I can apply that advice in the many challenging situations that always come up. I think my advice the advice that I will give to the next guest, which is also advice that the general advice I give on kind of fitness, but also on life. It's more of a sort of an aphorism that we always tend to overestimate how much we can achieve in the long term, but overestimate how much we can achieve in the short term, but underestimate how much we can achieve in the long term. And, the classic example of that is like someone wants to start running. They're like, I'm going to run a 5K, or I'm going to run a half marathon in 2 months because my friends are running one. It's like, you know what? You might be able to do it, but you might not, because you haven't you're overestimating what you can do in 2 or 3 months. But if you wanted, in 2 years, you could be running ultra marathons if that's what you wanted to do. If you were to be patient and just put in the time, put in the effort, put in the discipline day after day. So the general advice is to set ambitious goals, but give yourself lots of time to achieve them, and don't give up just because it doesn't. Things don't come to pass, or in the first stages.
Love that. That's fantastic advice to end this episode on. Alex, before we sign off, where can people find more of your work?
So I write a column about sports science, basically roughly once a week for Outside Magazine. So that's outsideonline.com. You can find me on X and other social media places. The handle is Sweat Science.
Fantastic. Alex, thank you so much for your time. This has been an amazing conversation. Like I said, learned a ton from your book. Learned even more just talking to you here today. So thanks again for coming on.
Thanks, Nick. It's been a lot of fun.